Dekila, welcome to the Interfaith Voices Podcast. I love all of the interviews I get to do on this podcast, and I'm not just saying this because I wouldn't have to. I was so excited all week when I knew I was going to get a chance to meet you and have a conversation about this film that you're involved with. And we'll get into that in a little bit. And I'll just give a little bit of a personal testimony. So the film is called Sacred Wisdom, Sacred Earth. And I'll just simply say my wife and I got a chance we took a date night and we went to see this film at First Unitarian Universalist in Madison. And the only without getting too wordy, which I'm always often guilty of, the only thing I'll say is it was life altering. It was life changing, and I'll
Yeah.
just leave it at that. So we've got a lot to talk about, but before we do, why don't you just introduce our listeners to who you are?
Sounds wonderful. Thank you so much, Matt. It's such an honor to be here on this podcast because we follow your work
That's
and we are
amazing.
so grateful for the work you do around issues like immigration and hold on. Did you see what just happened? I'm sorry. I'm gonna close down my Outlook, so I'll keep pinging. But we're so grateful for all the work you do and the leadership you show, organizing faith communities and clergy around immigration and other issues like that. So it's just such a privilege to be here.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, share a little bit about. I appreciate that. Thank
All
you.
right.
Share a little bit about yourself
So
now.
I originally come from the Himalayas. I come from a tiny place called Sikkim, which is, if you imagine the Himalayas, just imagine it's the little wedge of land between Nepal and Bhutan and right under Tibet. And I grew up there. I am the daughter of a Tibetan Buddhist nun and teacher and was raised very much in the heart of Tibetan Buddhism. Uh, and then always knew I was an environmentalist and came to the West to do my education and immediately began doing what is called field conservation. So immediately went into the field to do wildlife protection and wilderness area protection work, which has always been sort of like, let's just say, the deepest passion in my life, right? Um, and I don't think I ever thought about working with faith leaders or that I would end up working with indigenous leaders until 2008, when the head of my own lineage, which is the Karmakagyu lineage of Tibetan Buddhism, His Holiness the Karmapa, asked me to create environmental guidelines for Tibetan Buddhist monasteries and nunneries. So
Hmm.
it was very much this call to action from my faith leader. And I really took it that way and said, oh, yeah, I'll give up 2 weeks of my vacation and come work with your senior monks and, develop these guidelines and then go back to my real job. you know?
Right.
And instead, what ended up happening was I just took this step and it took me off the beaten path. And then I just kept going into the forest by myself. And before you knew it, I had started working with faith leaders everywhere in the world. I feel so amazed that I've had all these opportunities. I've worked with the Vatican and the Archdiocese of Rio and with Muslim clerics and Buddhists and evangelical preachers, and just sort of over time ended up realizing that the calling I had was to create safe spaces where faith leaders and indigenous leaders could work on environmental and climate issues with scientists and with other environmental and climate professionals. And that road that I described brought me to Madison, Wisconsin, in 2018. And I think one of the first things I did when I got here was reach out. I come from the Bhutia community in the Himalayas. We are indigenous to the Tibetan Plateau. And so, with that ethos, I think one of the first things I did was, through my network, look to see who I could meet with and who I might know in Wisconsin. And lo and behold, I was connected to, Elder Janice Rice of the Ho Chunk Nation and former Chairman Gary Bisa of the Menominee Nation and former Chairman Mike Wiggins Jr. of Bad River. And before I knew it, I we had this advisory council before we had even named Loka as the Loka Initiative. We had Indigenous advisors who were investing in what Loka should do and really investing time in telling me what Loka could be. And I feel like everything we've done with the documentary, with our work, really is an unfolding of their vision and
Mhm.
their trust, you know, and I don't take that lightly at all.
Yes. I'm not sure that I've ever heard of an initiative that brings those three elements together. So we've got the indigenous voices, we've got the faith voices, and then we've got the scientific voices. And you hear a lot of people stay in their lanes, in those three areas. But the idea to bring all of those folks together and all of those voices together is just unbelievable. I mean, the thinking behind that is even hard to comprehend, you know?
Okay, so
Um,
I have to stop you there because, you know, people often ask me, how did you plan it? And the truth is, I didn't plan any of it. Those three things are my identity, you know? It just was this natural manifestation of who I am, and therefore that combination felt natural to me,
yeah.
right? And I really do think, you know, having now worked with faith leaders all around the world, something that has come up again and again is when we share the data on climate change or, you know, on wildlife trafficking or water pollution and so on, most often the reaction I get from faith leaders is, why didn't anyone tell me? Why didn't anyone tell me how bad it was? Right? Because we putting ourselves in the shoes of faith leaders, they are tasked to do 1,000 things in their congregation and their house of worship, you know, and so the environment and climate issues have always or often felt distanced for them, right? Somebody else, scientists are taking care of that, or the government is taking care of that. That is not my lane, exactly how you put it. And I think asking them to use their influence to affect the issue has been, um, honestly, has been probably strategically one of the best moves we could make. You know, there's a handful of us that have been doing this work. Around the world. But I also think what it has done is healed something that's been missing in the environmental world and in the science world, which is that in the 80s, we took the sacred out of the science,
Mhm.
right? We kind of stripped, you know, having worked for big nonprofits in the conservation movement, what I know firsthand is that we stripped out every kind of meaning other than economic meaning when we talked about the value of wilderness or the value of nature or wildlife. We would just bring it down to the dollar value, right? And we were assuming that's what will get people interested or invested. And the truth is, most of us who are environmentalists because we're in love with nature, right?
Mhm.
That's
Mhm.
at the heart of it. Or we really have a spiritual connection with nature. And so I see this initiative and other initiatives like Loka as a rebalancing of something that was broken for a long time.
Yes, and I do think, because I'm a child, so I grew up in the 80s and 90s basically. I was born in the late 70s, and so my only reference of this work is that the science community and the faith community are almost butting heads. A lot of the work, a lot of the times when I've tried to engage in these spaces, it was more of a one or the other, not collaborative in any way, shape, or form. And I would say not even just in this space, but in so many spaces, we are seeing such a broader sense of collaboration that's including the faith community. I mean, you already mentioned that we do work in immigration, we do civic engagement work, and all of those spaces. And I could keep going on and on and on. The voice of people of faith is so valuable in all of these spaces, and it adds an element that maybe the scientific world or other spaces don't add, and that's why it's vital. But I think around economic justice, earth justice, it's just even more so. And I
Yeah.
remember I used to get in some difficult conversations with, you had mentioned evangelicals. I had found myself in some challenging conversations with evangelical leaders at times who just seemed like they wanted to put an arm out and keep the environment and environmental justice at arm's length and didn't want to deal with it. And I'm a person that grew up in the Catholic culture and then ultimately in the Christian tradition. And if you read our sacred texts, which are the Bible, you can't go very far without finding references to the earth and to
Absolutely. Yeah,
and so it's
creation,
it's
all of
shocking.
creation.
It's shocking that we're now talking about, oh, we're finally having these conversations. But I don't want to get too far off topic because I do want to make sure that we talk specifically about the film as well. So again, the film is called Sacred Wisdom, Sacred Earth. And when I was looking for somebody, because after I saw the film, the first thing I wanted to do is I just need to talk to somebody about this film because it's made such an impact on myself and my wife. And then I was led to you, and they said, you've got to talk to Dekila because this was in so many ways her idea. And so tell me where this idea
Yeah.
and tell me where it came from, and then maybe share with the listeners a little bit about what is at the heart of this documentary.
So I have to say it was not my idea, although I executive produced the documentary, it was not my idea. So it really began, I think in 2021, we had an online event, which we call Sacred Wisdom, Sacred Earth. And what we were going for at that time was to platform only Indigenous speakers from around the world to talk about the human, our human relationship with land and how that can be a healing relationship as opposed to a negative or extractive relationship only. And what emerged from that experience, first of all, we had, I think, 1,700 people sign up. So we were not ready for any of that interest.
Wow.
What emerged, one of the things that emerged from that were a lot of Indigenous youth were signing in from all over the world saying that was the first time they were in direct conversation with an elder. And having grown up with my grandmother and being raised by her for periods of my life, that was unimaginable to me. The source of so much of my strength as an Indigenous woman comes from my relationship with my elders, right? And them sort of drumming wisdom into me a lot of the times, I was not listening. And so that opened up a conversation with Loka's Indigenous Advisory Council, which has, the people I mentioned, Gary Bisaw, Janice Rice, Mike Wiggins Jr., but also other people like Aaron Birdbear and Juanita Cabrera Lopez and so on. And so this idea that we create a documentary that would, in some sense, preserve and uplift the voice of Indigenous knowledge for future generations emerged from that. But Janice is the person who said, we want Loka to create a pathway that brings the lost ones home. And that just was so evocative to me. It stayed with me so much because I am so far away from my homelands, but spiritually and psychologically, never am separate from it. And then I was trying to imagine what that's like if that wasn't the case. And I did not, that connection was severe. And that, I have to tell you, even imagining that was damaging. Even imagining that was very frightening for me, And so from there, it started becoming clearer and clearer that what we were talking about was a film and it had to be a documentary. And then I joke about it, but the truth is when they actually made the ask, I looked around at the team and myself. Collectively, we have zero filmmaking experience. There's nobody in my team that's had anything to do with filmmaking. And then we all were like, okay, sure.
Yeah, sounds like a plan.
And we've been so lucky because we had so many people trust us with this idea and trust us in partnering with us. We found Bravebird, Alejandro Miranda Cruz, very early on in the process, who joined us as the film director. We had this huge group of Native elders and knowledge holders and youth that became involved in the design of the film. Professor Brian McInnes, who is up at UW Eau Claire, is very respected Ojibwe Midewibin and a professor at the same time, became the producer for the film. So it became this, I think the thing that makes it special, the thing that I always highlight is that it's a community-based project. It's dreamt of, it's designed, it's organized, written, interviewed, filmed, edited, all of it mainly by Indigenous people and especially tribal members of Wisconsin. So, in a very practical way, what that means is that we never got lost, right? We didn't get a chance to be lost. We were completely surrounded and working in tandem with folks for whom their relationship with the land and waters of the Great Lakes is first and foremost a spiritual relationship. And so one of the things that I was told very early was that we had to make sure that nature was the main protagonist in the film. And so there were certain pieces of wisdom that were emerging that really helped us even shape what the film would look like and how much time we would, quote unquote, give to nature, right? Where no one's speaking, there are no humans. We're allowing people to immerse in nature in the ways that Native peoples have done through time immemorial, right? And have healed in the process. There was a lot of interest from the very beginning that we make sure that the process feels immersive because, you know, most Native people now in the United States, I think there are more Native people in urban settings than in reservations and in rural areas. And so it was really clear that there might be people who've never had this experience of being in a forest, right? And so how do we bring that to them? And so coming back to the vision of the film, like this really was meant to be, and I hope comes through, that it is a love song. You know, it is a love song for and to Indigenous peoples. It is a love song to the Great Lakes, right? By Indigenous peoples of the Great Lakes. It's a love song for Indigenous youth. It's a love song for all of us who love nature, who find, you know, solace or who find healing or who are exalted, who experience spiritual exaltedness in nature, right? It's for all of us. And the number the number of people that we found to interview was quite amazing. We were not expecting so many people to say yes. It was really beautiful. People fed us while they were being filmed, you know. And it was hard coming up with 1 hour documentary. I mean, given the amount of footage we have, it could have been 6 hours. It was really hard trying to just stay focused on a 1 hour documentary. But what we did know that we really wanted to emphasize, I think is said right at the end by Tina Kakan, which is, you know, stay strong, keep going, and really imbue people with this sense of courage in a time of climate collapse, right? With a sense of conviction that we survive. And the reason why we survive is we come together as community, right? And that is the secret of how we get out of this together. And I also think finally that what was really important and what came through, I think, in a lot of the interviews was that we put in the time to protect what is important. And something that is very notable, right? And something that has always been interesting to me is that whenever I've talked about faith and Indigenous peoples deserving and, you know, requiring a seat at the table on environmental and climate policy and decision making, it's amazing to me how little people know about why wilderness areas even are intact anymore, and that we have Indigenous peoples to thank all around the world, or faith leaders to thank all around the world. I'm thinking about things like, you know, the church forests in Ethiopia, right? There are these forests that are protected by local churches, Christian churches, right? All over the world. The reason there is biodiversity that's intact in so many of these wilderness areas is because there are Indigenous peoples and faith leaders for whom their faith is connected to the protection of these spaces, because these are sacred spaces, right? And so
Yes, I love
I'm
that.
getting really carried away, but
Oh, and I could
I
listen to
think
you all day
this
long.
was
So
this was what was really driving us to make this film. And it took us 4 years, by the way.
yeah, I
It took us a
appreciate.
very long time.
I did hear it took a while to put out. And, you know, I do want, you know, as we're talking about this, and I'm hoping that a lot of people will listen to this and find a way to view the film. And, you know, a lot of the work that probably both of us engage in is very daunting and sometimes can feel very dark and very almost apocalyptic at times. And one of the things that if I was going to a screening for a lot of things, I'm like, okay, am I going to go? And I'm a documentary junkie. I love documentaries. But if I was going to a documentary, a lot of times I'm like, okay, I'm going to go gonna watch this documentary. I'm gonna be totally demoralized when it's over because it's gonna tell me something that I need to know, but I'm gonna just feel like the earth is crumbling. And there was a little bit of fear about that with this going into it, but I just want to, say to anybody listening and to you as well, like I came away from this and my wife as well came away from this feeling a deep sense of hope and a deep sense of conviction as well. I guess I would put those two words there, because it definitely made me feel as if there's hope for our earth, there's hope for our planet, but it's going to require something out of me, which I'm more than willing to give the time and energy to do. And a couple of the pieces, one thing that I love that you all did is the gentleman that was there kind of presenting the film had mentioned that you, for the first, you said this took you 4 years. For the first year and a half was just time sitting and listening without cameras, which I thought was incredible. And then there was this piece, this almost a theme about, we as Americans, especially we as white Americans, have this unhealthy relationship with ownership. Right? We want to own things. We want to, be in possession of things that we worked so hard, so now it's ours. And I'm not belittling people who have worked hard to get what they've gotten in this life, but when we think about the earth and when we think about land and all of that, this isn't for us to own. And my wife and I, we have a house on some acreage in northern Wisconsin, and it really helped us to rethink because we've never felt like we wanted to own this. We just felt like we wanted to be a part of it, if you will. And I think the way that the film portrayed that piece of that ownership is not an option. It's just how we care for this thing that's all of ours. I was at an event last year at the Capitol, and there was an indigenous gentleman there who began the whole event, and he began it by saying, this land that we're on belongs to none of us, but I just want you to know from somebody who's been here the longest that you are welcome on this land. I thought that was really moving. So.
Yeah, it's interesting because the land back movement is so powerful because it's brought so much awareness to people. First of all, that this land is indigenous land, right? And I think people often get locked into the idea that land back just means you give land back. And I think there are many ways you can do land back. And this project, in some ways, that is the ethos we're living up to, right? We knew from the very beginning that none of the wisdom that is portrayed in the film belongs to us as the people who created the film. This is indigenous knowledge. Can only be owned by indigenous peoples, And what was challenging and what was also really fun, honestly, was the first year and a half that you mentioned. Some folks had a lot to get off their chest about how they were unhappy with the history of what had happened in Wisconsin with their tribes, and specifically with the university, that there was trauma that had never been resolved. And so one of my responsibilities starting this project, Loka is housed at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, was to take that seriously and was to think about the film and the production of the film as a way to heal some of those rifts. So one of the things you may or may not know is we entered this partnership with the Great Lakes Intertribal Council. They represent the leadership of all 12 tribes of Wisconsin, nationally recognized tribes of Wisconsin. And the film itself will actually be lodged long-term with Glitzy and not with Loka. We're really clear that if anyone wants to use the film, right now we're in the process of getting it out there, and our priority was to first get it shown in tribal communities in Wisconsin. We were very committed to that. We have, we're a tiny team of 4 people with some support. And so we knew we could just do the showings and screenings on tribal lands. And I think we brought it to Madison a few times. But this year, now that we've done that, we're going to open it up and more people will have chances to see it. It'll be in film festivals and so on. But going back to the idea of why we partnered with Glitzy, it was really important to us that this film actually be long-term housed by the indigenous leadership and by the indigenous tribes of Wisconsin, and that they get to make the decision what to do with the film long-term. that we did this and Loka did this as an act of, gratitude, really, to the tribes, and that our responsibilities are basically to get it to back to them in a way that is most useful to them. And then it's up to them what they want to do with it, right? We're here to support that. So based on the dialogue we've had with Glitzy and our Indigenous Advisory Council, we know our next steps is really going to move towards having, native designed curriculum, that age appropriate curriculum that go with the phone. So that is something that's really important to the tribes, and for us as well, that this film continues to build a bridge between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people that is actually, I would say, productive, right? Because so much of that conversation can go in directions that actually does not move us forward. Sort of, we're just rehashing a lot of old history and defensiveness on both sides and anger on both sides and recrimination and so on. And what this film does, I think, is recognize how brutal the history was for Native folks, right? And the tribes in Wisconsin. There's just been so much injustice, right? And also have a dialogue where we then say, okay, now what? How do we move forward? And how do non-Indigenous folks support Indigenous sovereignty in Wisconsin and the Great Lakes area? And I think it's really important that we use the word sovereignty, right? Because we've glossed over that so much deliberately for the last 400 years. And maybe the moment has arrived to talk about how it is Indigenous sovereignty that is why we're able to enjoy nature in Wisconsin. That is the reason why. Right. So
Yes.
how do we show up? How do we as non-Indigenous people, in my case, as an immigrant, show up, right? To show our gratitude and to support Indigenous-led initiatives, in
So
Wisconsin.
that leads me honestly to one of the biggest questions that I've kind of had in my heart ever since watching this film, and this has been a lot of conversation in my own household as well, is I felt, my wife and I both, we felt this deep need to want to connect to the Indigenous community in Wisconsin because it seemed obvious through, which we already knew, but the film brought us, even a deeper awareness of this knowledge that our Indigenous community in Wisconsin and elsewhere has. But culturally, there always has felt, growing up in Wisconsin, there always has felt to be a bit of a divide, as if I don't know how to get to this wisdom, if you will. And this film was a piece of it, right? I got to hear directly from these Indigenous leaders and Indigenous people from Wisconsin. And it made me feel like, okay, this is step one. But then, hearing them talk about these forests and the way that they harvest the forest, there was so many questions I had and so much that I wanted to experience. And when they talked about the sustainable forest, the only thing I wanted to do is get in my car and get there so I could experience just being in that. And so I guess a question for you, if you're able to answer it, is if there's people like me in this world that want to know what would be a good first step of creating a bridge over that either real or perceived divide that we all have experienced. What would be a first, beyond watching the film, which I would say is a first step for anyone?
Yeah.
After that, what would be a maybe a logical next step, or two or three or four or five?
Yeah. So the first thing I want to say real quick is the forest you're mentioning is the Menominee Forest, and it is magnificent. It is probably the best managed forest I've ever seen, and I've done environmental field conservation all over the world, right?
Wow.
You can see it from space. If you look at y'all go look at a satellite map of North America and you will see this little green block. That is the Menominee Forest.
Wow.
Everything around it is brown. And the reservation itself is this like green verdant color, it's amazing.
Amazing.
So I think coming back to this question, I can tell you a little bit about my personal experience. I came to this country when I was 16, and like I said, being, Indigenous and being from the Buttir tribe, I really wanted to connect with Native folks. In undergrad, I came up with this crazy idea that I would study nuclear dumping in Native reservations. And in those days, we had no cell phones. So this is in the early 90s. And I began calling landlines. And I actually was invited by the Mescalero Apache tribal leaders who were opposing nuclear dumping to come there. And then I ended up doing my independent thesis on it there. And my experience ever since has been this deep, deep sense of welcome and gentle, sometimes wariness, but this gentle, caring acknowledgement of kinship. And I really say the story to get people to understand just how warm-hearted Native peoples are. That's the reason why white people could survive the winters when they
Right.
first arrived as settlers, right? Um, and so I think understanding that if you approach Native folks with humility and you are there to help, understanding that it takes time to build trust. So please don't make it this transactional. I'm here, what can I do? Oh, you're not talking to me, I'm going to leave, because that is that is a sign of real self-centered privilege, right? Let's not do that, okay? Yeah.
Well, the funny thing, as you say that, Dekila, I'm sure there's a lot of people listening that are like, "Oh, yeah, that's how I would have gone in. That's probably how I'd have went in." So I appreciate that the little bit of knowledge there, that even in the approach is important.
Yeah, I think the second thing is, and I'll now speak as an indigenous person from the Himalayas. It's really easy to exoticize communities that are still living in cultural ways that are intact and tied to land, especially for indigenous communities. And we are just used to seeing a lot of white people come and see us as subjects, right?
Hmm.
They come to do their research, or they come because they want to experience this for a week, or they want a sweat lodge, or they want ayahuasca or something, but it's very extractive, that relationship.
Hmm.
So what happens is you end up either distrusting people outright or having a barrier where you are waiting to see if the real person shows up beyond the extractive kind of nature of the
Hmm.
interaction. And so I'm being really upfront because that is my experience and my personal experience. And I want folks to understand what's happening for Indigenous people everywhere, not just here. And so the most important thing I think people can do is look for the issues that Indigenous people are grappling with. So I can tell you just, off the top of my head, we have pipelines, right? Line 6. I mean, we have so many pipelines up north that are going through tribal territory that are going to pollute the Great Lakes,
Hmm.
not just tribal lands, but the Great Lakes. But so, in terms of who actually shows up, put their bodies on the line to protest or to protect, it's going to be Native folks. And so that is one clear area where you can join and actually uplift an issue that Native people are leading on. There
And I
are
just
other
want to,
issues like
speaking of that,
mining.
yeah,
Yeah.
speaking of that specific issue, and then I want you to keep going. What we're seeing in some of our fight against the horrific things that are happening against our immigrant population in our country is the importance of the white faces in the room,
Right.
and the importance of faith leaders in a room in these fights. And so never, we were I was having a conversation with my board of directors the other day, and one of them mentioned that, he's like, it probably shouldn't be this way if the world were perfect, but the importance of a white face in this space could really matter. And it
Exactly.
wasn't talking about this specific area, but I just want to make sure that people know that matters. It matters when we link arms with people that don't look like us. It matters when we link arms with people that people think we shouldn't be linking arms with, culturally or historically or whatever. And so, we do a lot of civic engagement work as well. And, this is a space where we could look at, okay, what can we do at the polls? Who can we contact about these pipelines running through? Because this matters, and so this conversation could go a million different ways, right? But everybody can find their connecting point to an issue that would matter to our
Yeah.
our tribal communities and our indigenous
Yeah.
community.
And I think starting local, just looking around to see what reservations are around you or what tribes are, sort of organizing around you, because not all of us are in rural areas where
Mhm.
there are reservations. Many of us are in urban areas. So really trying to understand and map out who is doing work, right? That is protecting indigenous sovereignty, indigenous rights, cultural knowledge, environmental resources, and so on. But there are tons of issues in Wisconsin itself. There is the issue of mining that the Menominee folks have been fighting for a long time. Mostly right now, it's been good. There is the issue of dams. There are dams on the Wolf River, for example, and other rivers that need to be removed, right? And so coming back, I think, as much as possible to thinking about, it's really easy for us to see them as invisible or not see them at all because the media so rarely covers Native issues, and mainstream media, as we know, rarely portrays them as full human beings living next to us as neighbors, right? It's kind of like, oh, they existed 400 years ago, you know? And so I think coming back to thinking through how they're being impacted, for example, our administration has removed a lot of funding. What does that mean for the tribes up north that depend on that funding to feed elders, right? How do we support things like the Menominee and other folks? There is a whole Great Lakes Intertribal Food Coalition right now, which is trying to make sure that all the elders and all the tribal people are fed. Getting involved in issues like that, if the issue that brings you in is hunger, listen, there is a project out there where tribal leaders are really looking for allies and need support, right? So what I would say is entering it with an issue you're already passionate about would be important, and means you're in it for the long term, and it's a sustained effort and not just a one-off, like I've shown up for this march or I've shown up to this event and my job is done, right?
Yeah, that's such wisdom. And so the wisdom you just threw out there, that should be, everybody should write that down and keep that in mind with everything you engage in.
Yeah, I think it's really easy for us to look around and think somebody else is going to lead or somebody else will heal. And the truth is each one of us is a healer. Right? We do it naturally in our families. We do it among our friends that we've been doing it since we were in middle school, probably, right? Two friends fight, we get in between and we're trying to, like, hopefully, we're the kid that's like, okay, no, everybody, let's get along, and not the kid that's inciting it further. But, we know how to heal divides. We know how to heal conflict. We have been doing it naturally in our families or among our friends or in our communities. So I think entering this work, understanding that you have the potential to heal something that's broken. And really, I'll be really upfront to the white listeners, please get over your white guilt. Like, just it's become a barrier, and it often is used as a crutch or an excuse, right? You have to do that inner spiritual work to move beyond it. And it is hard in our spiritual work to say, yeah, I'm carrying this thing that was bequeathed to me, and I'm going to heal that, and I'm going to move on because I want to reverse that relationship that I inherited, right? That story does not end with your ancestors giving you that weight. That story ends with what you do with it, right? And so I just want to be really direct and upfront about how hard that is and how healing that is and how necessary it is in the times we're in. Because the only way we're getting out of this is us banding together. Despite our differences, we find what we agree on, right? And we band together because that's what it's going to take.
That is amazing, and that's a perfect place to stop. Dekila, thank you so much for your time. I'm telling you, what you speak about matters so much to me that I don't like to stop our conversation, and I would sit here and take up all of your time for the entire day if I could. But I can't thank you enough for not only your work on this documentary, but just your work in general that you're doing is just unbelievably inspirational and moving in every way, and the spirit that you bring with it speaks loudly of who you are, I think. And I can't thank you enough for just giving a little bit of time to me today. I sure appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Matt. It's been such a pleasure. I'm so excited, and I hope we get to talk more and build things together. I'd really like that.